can we say something about the relation between Japanese Zen garden and its origin in China? How much influence Japanese Zen
Yes.
gardens derive its inspiration from China?
The original gardens in Japan were really Chinese, based on Chinese gardens,
Right.
before Zen Buddhism. Because Buddhism was brought to Japan from China through Kariya. And so the first Buddhist temples were built in the Chinese style by Chinese and Korean craftspeople.
Okay.
And with them, the first gardens were built in the same style. But then as Buddhism changed over centuries, right? So we're talking from Buddhism was introduced in the 6th century.
Right.
And by the 13th, 14th century, there had been a shift towards Zen Buddhism, which is much more austere. And so the gardens were adapted from the earlier, more Chinese-style gardens to what we now call Zen gardens, which tend to be simpler, more graphic,
Right.
and often much smaller. You know,
Yep.
many of them are tiny gardens, maybe only 3 meters by 4 meters, very small gardens.
Can you tell us the components, the major components of a Japanese Zen garden? Maybe you talk about modern Zen gardens and traditional Zen garden. Maybe first you need to address the difference between these two gardens, and then tell us about the components of Japanese Zen gardens. Okay, we see rocks, we see trees, we see pea gravel,
Right.
and many other components. But what is it that constitutes a Zen garden?
Well, the idea with the Zen garden is how do you create emptiness, right? And then how do you create change? And so the different components, whether it's a traditional garden or a modern Zen garden, are typically the same. But one thing that you see more in the modern Zen gardens is a little bit more strong geometries and more marks of the hand of man. So, so rocks that are formed where you see how they're formed, maybe they're polished. In the traditional gardens, the rocks generally are more naturalistic.
Yeah.
But the components, each component has a very specific purpose. So a rock has a character, it has a personality, it is believed.
It's animated or something.
It is, and maybe we don't understand that, right?
Yeah.
But for someone like Shunyo Masano, who is trained for so long, he can discern the characters of the rocks. And he can understand which rocks will work well together because they support each other. So the rocks have character. The pea gravel is used to create a flat plane. Often that creates the emptiness.
Right.
And it contrasts with the rocks, and it contrasts with different kinds of plantings. And the plantings help to add that sense of changeability.
Right.
So through the changes that take place in seasons, flowers or leaf colors, as we were talking about, or also as a branch blows in the wind, that sense of change too.
Right. And then there's a mention of Zen gardens as the abode of the mind, where the mind dwells,
Yes.
for the Japanese
Yes.
people. What does that mean? Is it the place that we go for practicing meditation or something like that? For a Zen garden?
So the original purpose of a Zen garden was for meditation.
Yep.
And they were typically associated with a Zen temple. So the monks, as part of their training, would maintain the garden, rake the gravel, but also as part of their training could meditate. Because when you see a Zen garden and you see a rock in a Zen garden, you don't really know how big that rock is. Are you seeing the whole rock, or are you only seeing 10% of the rock? So the idea is if you can meditate and observe for a long time, you will understand how large that rock is. So that was part of the training for the monks at the temples. These days, many of us don't have time to sit and meditate long enough to understand how big the rock is. But we can spend 10 minutes, and maybe it calms us, helps us relax, helps us think through some issues that are in our mind, or just moves us away from the chaotic everyday life, like here in Bangkok, right, or in Tokyo. And so the Zen gardens today are really a place where the mind can dwell in peace. So it's partly to move someone away from everyday cares and the craziness of everyday life. And it's also partly to reconnect with nature. Shunyo Masuno speaks a lot about how in our contemporary lives we've moved away from our relationship with nature and how important it is to regain that relationship.
Right. And do you have that experience, to be in tune with nature through Zen Gardens? From your personal experience, you have that?
I do have that. And partly because I have the opportunity to visit so many gardens that I have learned to do that, but partly because when you enter a Zen garden, it's so different in design from the street outside that it's easy to make the switch in your mind and reconnect with nature because there's so many things happening in a Zen garden.
So it's true then that people did meditation in Zen Garden in the past.
It is true.
But now it's for the training of the mind if you have time. But as we know that empty spaces in Japan are quite scarce these days, especially in Tokyo or maybe in Bangkok.
Yes.
Yes, so what's the functionality of the Zen Garden in the modern Zen, in the modern world right now, as compared with the traditional model Zen Garden?
Well, Shunyo Masuno feels that it's very important that we find ways to reconnect people with nature. And so for him, designing a Zen garden is a way to do that. Because if you enter a Zen garden, you must leave the world outside and cross into the Zen garden. And there are two types of Zen gardens, really. There's a type where you sit and you look at the garden. You just view it. You don't walk. You don't move through it.
Right.
And there's another type that you walk through. So either way, you have to make the effort to observe the garden. And that effort allows you to reconnect with nature, to clear your mind. So both the traditional gardens, even the old gardens, for example, in Kyoto in Japan, there are many old Zen gardens that you can visit, and they're very beautiful. So it's whether it's an old traditional garden or one of Masuno's newer traditional style gardens or one of his contemporary Zen gardens. They all have that element of allowing you to change your mind, right? To kind of flip the switch from, oh, I have to stop at the store and buy milk, and I have to do this and meet this person and make that appointment, to let me just sit and think and watch the leaves blow in the wind.
Yeah. We are learning how to have peace and tranquility and integrate that into our modern lives. But unfortunately, we have to leave it there because we're running out of time at the moment. But we will continue with the conversation and exploration deep into the world of Zen Gardens again next week in Bookcase. I have to thank you for coming to the show for this edition of Bookcase. Hope to catch up with you again in next week episodes of Bookcase.